So a day early, but happy Father's Day to all of you. And I know it'll be a fun day tomorrow. Getting together with my family. I'm going to go home, pick up Shelley, and go to Red Deer for the afternoon service, then scoot on over and spend tonight and tomorrow with some extended family and the kids. But it's, my wife even took a rose out of the garden this morning. First of all, the poor thing is lucky to even get this far, but it won't get any further now that it's there. And somebody actually sent me a nice card that wasn't one of my kids, just to acknowledge that this is a weekend that deserved a little bit more perhaps than the acknowledgement that it's a Hallmark celebration. So if you're a dad, I hope you have a good time. And I'd also like to add, if you're a grandfather or an uncle or a mentor, a big brother, that this is an important role. They say it takes a man to make a man. And in some way or another, anyone who has masculine influence on a kid or a grandkid wants to promote and support a daughter or granddaughter, good on them. To be honest, it has been observed that it is better for a single parent to raise a family than to have a single parent and a toxic influence. And so in this day and age of many single parent families, where you might grieve the fact that a father is missing, sometimes it is better that a mother, with the help of God, succeed than a mom struggle with the downward pull and the negative influence of a toxic male influence. And that may be a shocking thing to say up front, but I have, thoughts on this particular subject. I think of a kid by the name of Michael Jackson. Anybody remember a kid by that name? I got a picture here somewhere of Michael, the gloved one. You think of him, his nickname was what? Wacko Jacko. And you wonder where he came from. He was brilliant in so many ways, the king of pop and so forth. Died tragically a few years ago now. But before he died, he spent 30 or 40 hours talking to somebody he was close to by the name of Rabbi Shmuley Botich. You imagine going through life with a name like Shmuley Botich. But anyway, he was a rabbi. And the rabbi had long, extensive conversations that were recorded confidentially with the express purpose of revealing the man's heart at some time in the future. And the conversations ranged across the subjects of his childhood, his loneliness, and his relationships with others. Breaking into the conversation, Shmuley asked, was there an age at which you realized, oh my gosh, I missed my childhood? And the response was, yes, I remember distinctly. It's like being on a ride, you can't get off, and you think, oh my God, what did I do? And you're committed and you can't get off. It hit me before I was a teenager. I wanted so badly to play in the park across the street because the kids were playing baseball and football, but I had to record. I could see the park right across the street, but I had to go into the other building and work until late at night making the albums. I sat there looking at the kids with tears running down my face, and I would say, I'm trapped. I have to do this for the rest of my life. I'm under contract. But I wanted to go over there so bad, and it was killing me just to make a friend and say hi. I used to walk the streets looking for somebody to talk to. I told you that. How old were you when all of this realization came upon you? Well, actually, it was during the Thriller album. So you were the biggest star in the world. And yeah, I was looking for people to talk to. I was so lonely, I would cry in my room upstairs. I would think, that's it, I'm getting out of here. And I would walk down the street. I remember really saying to people, will you be my friend? You were probably in shock. Yeah, they were like, Michael Jackson? I would go, oh God, are they going to be my friend because of Michael Jackson or because of me? I just wanted somebody to talk to. I remember him actually publicly, he was invited to speak at Oxford University in England. And partway through whatever he was talking about, he just started to tear up and cry. And he said, all I ever wanted was for my dad to love me. So he said, all I ever wanted was my dad to love me. Looking into this transcript, He said this. He said, I suffered a lot in that way. I knew that something was wrong with me at the time, but I needed someone. That's probably why I had mannequins. I would say because I felt I needed people, someone I didn't have. I was too shy to be around real people. I didn't talk to them. I wasn't like old ladies talking to plants, but I always thought I wanted something to make me feel like I had company. I always thought, why do I have these? They're like real babies, kids, and people, but it makes me feel like I am in a room with people. You know, Michael, I used to judge my father a lot. And one day I stopped judging him because he had his own challenges. He has had a very difficult life, and that began in abject poverty in Iran. And it wasn't easy for Jews growing up in Iran. Who knows what his childhood was like? Do you still judge your father? Well, my dad said, why didn't you sign the contract? I go, I don't know. He goes, well, sign it. If you don't sign it, you're in trouble. It's like, oh my God, why? Where is the love? Where is the fatherhood? I go, is it really this way? He would throw you and hit you as hard as he can. He was very physical. Did you begin to feel that you were a money-making machine for him? Yes, absolutely. Just like Macaulay Culkin described, so you felt used? Yes. And one day, I hate to repeat this, but one day he said, and God bless my father because he did some wonderful things and he was brilliant. He was a genius, but one day he said, if you guys ever stop singing, I'll drop you like a hot potato. It hurt me. He would think, these kids have a heart and feelings. Wouldn't he think that would hurt us? If I said something like that to Prince and Paris, that would hurt. You don't say something like that to children, and I never forgot it. It affects me in my relationship to this day. So if you didn't perform for him, he would stop loving you? He'd drop us like a hot potato. That's what he said. Did your mother always run over and say, don't listen to him, he doesn't mean it? She was always the one in the background when he would lose his temper, hitting and beating us. I hear it now. Joe, no, you're going to kill them. No, Joe, it's too much. And he would be breaking furniture, and it was terrible. I always said if I ever had kids, I would never behave this way. I won't touch a hair on their heads because people always say the abused abuse. And it's not true. It's not true. I am totally the opposite. The worst I do is make them stand in a corner for a little bit, and that's it. And that's my time out for them. I think you're right. I hate when I hear things like that abused people abuse. It means that you're condemned to be a bad person. Yeah, it's not true. I always promised in my heart that I would never be this way, never. And it can be a movie or in a department store, I hear someone arguing with their children. I break down and cry because it reflects how I was treated when I was little. I break down at that moment and I shake and I cry. I can't take it. It's hard. I remember I went to Berlin some years ago. I'd gone over there, spent some time with Colin Lachlan, and I took the train to Berlin and took the U-Bahn to the first concentration camp, go looking some of those things. It was cold. But I was on walkabout, as they say in Aussie. And I was just a few hundred yards down from the Brandenburg Gate, the Starbucks, and right across the street is the Hotel Alden Kempinski. Ever heard of the Hotel Alden Kempinski? All right, okay. You know why it's famous? That's where Michael Jackson stayed. And people gathered around outside and they cheered because he was in town. And they asked for him to come to the window. You remember that? And he came to the window and he was so excited to show them, this is my baby. This is my baby. And he leaned out of the window. And everybody went freaky because they thought he was going to drop the baby or something crazy like that. But to this day, that hotel is famous for the fact that that's where Michael Jackson hung his kid over the balcony. He wasn't doing any such thing. He came and said, this is my kid. This is my child. I am so happy. And of course, he had 3 children, and he didn't have them the way all of you did. He had a surrogate mother and a few other things in there. But he was just devoted to his kids, and his attitude, his approach, his whole reason for being was shaped by an abusive father. You take a look at this next picture. This is him at one particular stage, just walking with his kids on an occasion, and he's got them draped because he didn't want them to be overwhelmed with publicity, and he wanted them to have some sort of life and privacy, and this was his way of coping. But Wacko Jacko was the direct result of a brilliant young kid in his own realm who was forced and bent, and his dad was, a dysfunctional tyrant. I remember when the funeral was held, because everybody was interviewing everybody else, and Al Sharpton was there, and everybody else was speaking. But Michael Jackson's dad was interviewed on the way into the funeral, which I think was at the Staples Center. The big, they had thousands and thousands of people there for the public celebration. And I'll never forget the one thing I remember. He may have said other things, but somebody pushed a microphone in front of him, and he looked, and he stopped and somberly said, I've just launched a new record label. That's what he said on his way to his son's funeral. And that was the impression I got. Now, in the words of Michael Jackson, my dad was brilliant. He was a genius. He was many, many things. But he was a father, but he was not a dad. He was not a dad. And when you have, even in its simplest form, a man who is a father and understands that he wants to be a dad, that is a very precious thing. I know some years ago there was a tension and difficulty in my own family, in as much as my oldest son is mine by adoption, and his birth father was sick. And this was shortly after his mother died. And so my son said to me, he was in conflict. He said, I hear, he named the person, is terminally ill. What should I do? And he prefaced it this way. He said to me, I know, he was anxious. He didn't want to ask the question. He said, I know who my dad is, but this man was once my father. What should I do? And I told him, I said, you should go and visit and see, and you never go wrong by doing the kind thing. So that's what he did, and I'm glad he did, and that's how he managed the situation. But it's interesting. I know who my dad is. And there's so many people who have problems with that concept. The law said simply, honor your father and your mother, okay? Honor your father and mother. Those words are emblazoned. Everybody knows that. The first commandment with promise, Paul terms it. And yet I know quite a few people who have serious difficulty. I've met a lot of people over the last decade, because becoming a landlord, you meet all sorts of people who aren't, your close community. I've met some really interesting ones. But one lady who was a very early renter, she was very, up and down and erratic. She was well employed, but she was off work frequently for one thing and another. And the time she moved in, brand new unit, and I couldn't sell it, so I became a landlord. And she moved in, and I was working with her father, and did a number of things and got her set. Got to know her daughters. She was a single mom and so forth. And a while later, she was off work, and she said she was on stress leave. And she explained to me that she had been ostracized by her extended family because she had been drawn into a lawsuit against her father for molesting her daughters. And she found it doubly devastating. And I can't believe that, because I met the guy, and there he was, and we worked, and he, I helped his daughter move in and all of that sort of thing. But she said, he molested me when I was a teenager, and I worked through that and forgave him and normalized relationships. And then she said, this late development, I discover he had hurt my own daughters the same way, because I had extended trust, because I had done this. Now the law is involved, and I am forced to testify. And she said, I just can't take this. And of course, this is all in the context of, I can't pay the rent right now, I'll make it up later, this type of conversation. And she explained eventually, it was in Wetaskiwin actually that the trial took place, and she was there for a week or so, but it was resolved by a plea bargain situation. As far as I know, the father's still in jail, and he's not the only one I know. I've visited, been aware of several who were in jail for this. But she said it was so devastating because her trust and her forgiveness had resulted in this. and that this was something the extended family were mad at her because she had cooperated with the prosecution. The prosecution had lowered the offense level so that the kids didn't have to testify, and what an absolute mess it was. And that's why I said, early on, sometimes I know a number of women who have raised their children without the presence of a negative, bitter, or abusive individual in their lives. I don't know how to summarize my thoughts on this commandment, and I'm going to read a summary here written by Joseph Tkach, the president of our denomination, in a piece he once wrote. He said, "Let me emphasize that we are not called to honor our parents on our own power. Instead, enabled by the Holy Spirit, we see them in the light of Christ, the light of what our Lord intends for them. In that light, we're able to honor our parents because we know that Jesus, as mediator, stands between us and them. He's the Lord and Savior of that relationship. We also know and trust that Jesus' purpose for us cannot be thwarted by bad parenting. Through him and by him, we have a heavenly Father who graciously rules over all earthly fathers and mothers. Giving honor to a parent is not mere emotion. It's an attitude that comes from faith, hope, and love in God through Christ and by the Spirit. Also, giving honor does not require a positive relationship. In some cases, a face-to-face relationship with a badly abusive parent is impossible. Nevertheless, Jesus calls on us to rise above the bad relationship, to extend honor, even if from afar. We do so by focusing on our relationship with Jesus, who enables us to grow into his maturity, including his ability to love the unlovely. We do so remembering how Jesus showed incredible honor towards us when we were completely dishonorable. One last thought: when children see parents honoring their parents, they will likely imitate that behavior. Despite the challenges, honoring others is a healthy activity for others as well as for ourselves. I've seen so many situations where, and in this day and age, there are a lot of marriages, sadly, that end in divorce. And one party, especially if there are children involved, will demand loyalty towards themselves and rejection towards the other party. The other party will put their bitterness and their anger out there and share it with others. And that's, of course, the opposite. And when we use this expression, honor your father and your mother, perhaps I could paraphrase that by saying, just don't slag, don't ridicule, don't damn to hell, there's people. I don't think that lady who confided in me what she was going through let the other residents around her know exactly what she had experienced. It was bad enough that her extended family knew, that she had to cope with her children. It was so stressful. I was kind of glad she was in a union job where she could get stress leave and paid psychiatric counseling. But, she didn't then go to the neighbors and the friends and put it on Twitter and YouTube and everything else. She just had to leave certain things alone, even that which she shared with me. And in a lot of families, the children or the parents will just they will form up a resistance, let's say, to somebody else. There are times when there is separation, physical separation, distance between people. But that doesn't mean to say you have to then go on the offensive from a distance and send in the rockets or the cruise missiles or share it with other people. And this is really, really a heartbreaking and heart-rending type of aspect to family. And in the day and age when families are troubled, it's kind of worth looking at that and asking, well, what's the high road to get through these things? It's interesting that Joe made the observation, when you extend a certain, and by honor I read restraint. By honor I receive, a refusal to gossip or to damn to hell other people, a desire to just maybe, pass over sin with some silence sometimes, just to extend that. Perhaps those who extend courtesy and mercy and whatever the stress and strain, just restraint, will, it's sometime or another, receive the same, that it comes back towards them. Now, having acknowledged the troubles and the difficulties, I have to say I haven't found it difficult to understand or relate to, but I have initially been shocked by some of the stories I've heard over the decades I spent in pastoral ministry. I enjoyed the love of good parents. My dad has been gone for quite a while now. A lot of you know my mother because she came over and she made the impression on you, dear old Mom. You never met my dad. My dad was this fellow here. You'll note he has a full head of hair. Moving right along. And he kept it, believe it or not, to the day he died. He was in his late 50s here in this picture. He always looked a little younger than he was. But there were some things about my father who was a very basic guy, very simple guy. He didn't shake heaven and earth. He didn't do a lot of spectacular things. He was part of a generation that was drafted. He didn't ever claim to be a hero. In fact, the way he told it, when he went to present himself for basic training, his father took one arm and his older brother, who worked in munitions, took the other, and they sort of supported him as he just turned 18. He went off to war. You know, he didn't rush off to conquer the world. He'd worked for the previous 3 years in a factory, and when he was drafted, he answered, but he wasn't. He didn't anticipate with great joy leaving home and going off to war. But the things I have to say about my dear dad were very simple things. He loved and he respected my mother. I think any man can be a successful dad if he starts by doing his kids a favor and loving their mother. That is a wonderful gift. My mom and dad were very open. I learned to argue from them. That is to say, they bickered back and forth occasionally, and I learned to say, yes, dear, I suppose that's the way we'll do it then. Because that's the way my father learned to end conversations. Not because my mother was domineering, but he understood my mother was, quite smart, and still is, actually. She likes to remind her grandkids when she whips them at Scrabble. My mom was head girl at her school, and she was also very academically quite astute. And so my father wasn't the same. He got out at 14, which was the way in his day. But he respected my mother and her insights and her abilities, and they acted very well. I may have told you this story in different contexts, but one thing that really illustrates it was, I was home with my wife and kids, and we were, big extended family get together, and Dad was already retired, and I made the comment to him, Dad, this old house is worth a lot these days in Bristol. Has it occurred to you that you could sell the old house, move across the Severn Bridge into Wales to somewhere like Chepstow, and you could actually buy a house over there for much better house, newer house, for half the price that you could sell this house for? And my father said, that's a really good idea. And here everybody's buzzing and fluttering, and he suddenly got all excited about that thought. And he looked up and he sort of, and you got to remember, the rooms are pretty small in England, so he sort of talked about 7 or 8 feet away. He said, Joan? Yes, Derek. Something, you know what we're going to do? We're going to sell the house and we're going to move over to Chepstow. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. And she looked at him and she said, what a ridiculous idea. Where did you come up with that one? Why would we move away from here? Why would I move from my garden? We're close to the grandkids. What the hell are you thinking? And he looked and he said, well, Robert came up with him. Well, shifting the blame onto me, and I asked her later, I said, well, why were you so ballistic in your response? She said, well, that's the first time ever your father has ever said to me, this is what we're going to do. We always discuss things. We always, work things out together. And he just looked over and said, we're selling the house and moving to Chepstow. And, of course, she went right into orbit. That was probably a quarter century ago to this day. If I want to get my mother's goat halfway through a conversation, I say, Mom, Yes, my dear? Have you ever thought of moving to Chepstow? And you can see on the phone, you can feel the blood pressure going up. I said, you half-baked nitwit, pumping your father up like that. And to this day, and it's a fun thing, maybe if you want to distract somebody in the middle of a conversation, you might say, squirrel, like that. All I say is, Chepstow, and she's off. But it was a testimony to the fact that my mother was flabbergasted. For the first time ever, my father announced unilaterally they were going to do something. And so I learned the good way that my dad and mom, they would talk, they would work things out. I remember as a kid, and back then they were paid by cash. And my father would every Friday by registered mail get an envelope, literally, where they would tuck the bills over the corner so you could count the bills without opening the envelope, and you could rattle the coins, and that was the week's pay from the previous week. And they would sit down and they would figure out and put it in envelopes together how they were going to make this work for the next 7 days. And they did things together, and they were a good team. Simply put, my dad loved my mother. That was a great gift. He talked to his kids back then, and I don't recommend this, but the idea was you should teach your kids. And so my dad would sit down and say, it's time for Bible study. Oh, well, I bet none of you do that to your kids. All right, we're going to have 30 minutes Bible study. Okay. But to this day, my father went through the Proverbs and made me discuss them with him. Now, my little sister, who was 10 years younger, would just sit there, But I had to participate in discussion. I can still remember the Proverbs and what they mean and the aspects to them. And I still instruct my mind from time to time. And so whether it was teaching or talking, my dad would engage quite often and on a regular basis. My dad had a very good work ethic. I was shocked when he told me at the age of 60 he planned to retire. That's just totally out of character. And it took me a while to wrap my head around the idea that he had had several heart attacks during his 50s. And that it was, and then he had this he thought he had a mini stroke. I just think there were nerves in his little finger went numb. But that shocked him. And he said, hey, and it was a good thing. He was my age when he died. Now, I believe that I'm going to live, as long as my mother, and my mother's 21 years ahead of me, and still going. So I have that anticipation. There's too much to do, but I was shocked when my dad said he wanted to retire, and that the stress and the strain of work was just, after several heart attacks, was a little too much for him. But he had a very good work ethic, and I remember as a little fellow, my father working 2 or 3 jobs back then when everybody was scrambling to make things in the early 50s to get along. The thing I look back and I questioned was, do I have to work alongside you, Dad? Yes, you do. Okay, why? Because there's enough work to go around. So especially on Sundays, it seemed we always had to, it seemed, especially when you live in old houses, there's always wallpaper to scrape off, and there's paint to do, and there's yard work to do, and where we lived at the time. But I look back on that, and I appreciate that. He worked with and alongside, and especially as years went by, and there were always sort of extra jobs after school or on the weekends in different situations. We worked together. Now, all those things rather mundane, perhaps, but one thing I always remember was, as a father, he told us he was proud of us. He loved us. He verbalized that. And even my last conversation with my dad, and this was a few years ago now when they used to charge an arm and a leg for transatlantic phone calls, but my mother did all the talking, which shouldn't come as a shock to anybody, but because she's quite verbal as my mom. But my father closed the conversation. He said, God bless my son. I love you, and I pray for you every day. Last words I ever heard from him. Those were the sort of things that he would say. And, not too often, but he didn't hesitate, which reinforced in my mind why you read this sort of stylized picture in the Old Testament of you should bless your children. And you think, well, what do you mean to bless your children? Well, it basically came out. The kids came, they sat down, and they talked about the future. And of course, it's in prophetic language. My son, may heaven open and rain down gifts upon you. May this happen, may that happen, may the other thing. These are positive visions I have for your future. And that was considered hugely significant. If you were Esau and your dad said that to Jacob instead of you, that really ticked you off. That really hurt you. It took you years to get over that. Not to your dear old dad who was blind, but to your brother who, quote, stole the blessing, stole the birthright, as it was termed. You know, even when you look at pictures like Moses, for example. Moses, before he dies, you know, what does he do? He stands up and he blesses the tribes. He says nice things about every one of them because they're God's kids. And he speaks for God. And they need to hear it verbalized. They need to hear the words stated. I remember when I was very first in ministry visiting Cecil. And Cecil was at odds with his teenage daughter, Bonnie. And I remember as I was, I was probably not even ordained yet, but I was sort of just visiting what was to become my first pastorate in Kamloops, and saying to this man who was old enough to have teenagers, and I was young enough to be only removed from teenage by 4 or 5 years. And he said to me, there's this strain and this tension between me and the daughter, and she's fighting and she's going in this direction. And I said, well, you have to tell her that you love her and you want to work with her. He said, well, she knows I love her. I said, well, do you tell her that? I don't have to tell her that. She should know. Well, how was she going to know unless you tell her? He told me about a year later, after things had worked through and they were beginning to improve again, he said, when you told me that, he said, I could have killed you. Well, it's a good job, Cecil, because I wouldn't be here now as a pastor. But he said, I had to learn that, and I learned that from a punk wet behind the ears like you. But the only frame of reference I had was, how would my father speak to me? What would he say? Even if I got my tail in a wringer and something was going wrong, what would Dad say? And he would say, look, this is serious. Now, remember, I love you and I'm here for you, but you really got to do something about this or that. And this was something he had to learn. His wife knew it, His dad knew it, but Cecil had to learn it. And it was, awkward to hear it from now 3 different places. And so, I remember it was interesting in as much as my wife who grew up without a father. In fact, it was worse than that. The father was removed. And it was serious, but she, after we were married some time, she actually wrote my dad a letter. I never knew about it, but thanked him for the good qualities that he had placed in his son. That's me, by the way. And she said, the qualities that he had learned from you are a blessing to me and to now the family that is growing and so forth. I never knew she wrote that. But it was the first time in her life that she had experienced certain positive things that came from positive fatherhood. I know when my sister, who's younger than I am, especially the last few years, I've grown to deeply appreciate and enjoy my sister. But we grew up. I left when she was, a little nipper. She was 6 or 7, and I was leaving, and got to know her a little bit in teenage years and so forth. But when she was married, she came over and she had a baby and was expecting the second one, her middle child, Jeanette, Nettie. And, the years have gone by. I had the joy. First wedding I did for the family was for Nettie. And it was kind of one of those nice things because I'd done Mom's wedding and Mom and Dad's wedding. Now I'm doing Nettie's wedding. And Nettie's going to come see us with her husband, Ilko, here in a few weeks' time. But here my sister arrived with one baby in a pram and expecting the second one. And we had this conversation about family and about Dad. And she made a few negative comments. And so it's sort of, for whatever reasons, she came to church that weekend. And so I remember I spoke about fatherhood. And I spoke in very positive terms about my dad, because I was older and I was raising kids, and I was probably irked by what my sister said, so I built some of that in the sermon. And she sat there and sort of listened. And afterwards, her only comment was, well, you certainly have significantly different impressions of our Father than I do. And that was it. And I pointed out to her, when I was growing up, all we had was work, and there was no fun. Because you notice I didn't, my dad wasn't, there was a lot of fun growing up. Everybody was strapped and broke and struggling and everything else. And of course, 10 years later, things were a lot better. And as I tried to inform my sister, you had it good, You remember that Monty Python skit? We grew up in a box in the middle of the road. You had a box. We used to dream about having a box, this sort of conversation. We grew up in hole in tip, this stupid conversation. Well, it didn't matter what I said to Esme. You were young, you were the only daughter, you had it good. A couple of years later, I went, and of course now she has 3 daughters. And my dad and mom were obviously very, very good to their 3 granddaughters. I had 4 kids. I'm in Canada. My brother is somewhere behind. He eventually has 2 sons who are lovely young men now. But here's my sister with her 3 little girls. And mom and dad, of course, adore them. And dad's been very, very helpful. And I made some little comment about whatever. And her response was so instructive. She said, "Oh, don't say that about dear old dad." Suddenly dad, now that she'd matured a little and she had 3 kids, was her hero. She'd reached the point in life that I had been, where I understood how good a man he was, and how good a father he had been, and how he was a dad. And she came to that point, she understood it now as a mature woman who was a mother and a homemaker and all these other things. And from then on, of course, Dad, anytime we got in a conversation, Dad was just her hero. And she had grown into that understanding and that appreciation and respect. And the law says, just learning to appreciate and respect your parents is a great blessing. And you should appreciate it. You notice Paul terms this the commandment with promise, pregnant Paul's, there it is. So that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. It works when you understand, there was sacrifice, there was unconditional love, there was a great deal of commitment on the part of somebody who helped me grow up. And that's why Father's Day is a good thing. I know tomorrow, my oldest granddaughter is going to get married. She wants to get married at a destination wedding at the Dominican Republic, the end of November. So a number of us have to schlep down there and do the wedding thing. It'll be nice. But you have to do certain legal formalities, as you know, when you get married. And if you haven't done legal formalities, well, maybe that's a complication you ought to address. But anyway, that's a little humor, by the way. You seem very somber. Anyway, you should sign certain papers, and you should register yourself as married. So I was talking to Aaron about it, and I said, well, when do you want to do this? Any old time's good. You can sign papers in Canada. You can formalize things and do that. And I said, well, just do it before we go. And it occurred to me, I said, well, look, if we're getting together on Father's Day, why don't you just you and Tyler decide to formalize it on that day, because then your dad can witness and his dad can witness, and that's kind of nice. Your dad's been gone the distance for you and with you, and we sort of left it up in the air. But I talked to her a few days ago, and I said, have you picked a date? When do you want to sign these papers and register these things? She said, well, I think we'd do it on Father's Day. And I thought, well, that was really kind, really nice, really sort of special. So I guess it's happening tomorrow. All I have to do is sign my name, take the signature of witnesses, and sign the registration number and a few other little things, and mail it in, and done. And then you have the big celebration at Dominican Republic at the end of November. No legal complications or anything like that. But to acknowledge that, to acknowledge the strength and the encouragement and all of the sacrifice your dad made, if you're going to acknowledge it at any time, Father's Day is a good day. To acknowledge that your father is not just your father, but your dad. Your dad. It's ironic when you come to a mature relationship with God, when you begin to appreciate how is it that Paul describes our connection with God. He said that the Holy Spirit inspires us to cry what? Abba, Abba, Father. Abba is the Aramaic, is the ancient word that means not father, but dad. I know who my father was, but I know who my dad is. I know where I came from, but I know where I belong. And that's the way Paul phrases it in Romans chapter 8. And Jesus emphasizes it in this way in Matthew 6 and verse 9. When you pray, he said, pray in this manner, our Father in heaven. This is the source from whence you came and the source to whence you should return. And this is the enduring Father who, unfortunately, human beings come and go. Human beings fail. Human beings sometimes need to be pushed away because of dysfunctional or abusive situations. Michael Jackson was scarred for life and had to separate himself from his father because of an attitude that said, either you perform or I'll drop you like a hot potato. On the other hand, I know that whatever I may have screwed up in life, my father would have said, I love you and I pray for you every day. Maybe there have been times when he would have had to pray about me, but he would have still prayed for me and about me and with me. When we are told to pray to our Father in heaven, we are praying and seeking an intimate relationship that reassures us that God is enduring and with us moment by moment. I think the best illustration I ever heard, well, one of the best I ever heard, was offered to me by Doug Smith. And he talked about the initiation that certain First Nations groups had. In Judaism, you are bar mitzvahed, you become a man. In other cultures, certain passages are the rite of passage. In this particular case, it was the story of young braves who were given a challenge as they transitioned from boyhood to manhood. And the challenge was that they were taken out into the forest and they were left there by themselves for the night. And that's what you had to endure. The fear of the darkness, the calls of the night, the sense of loneliness, the fact that you had to survive. Perhaps you had to make your little lean-to like a Boy Scout, or you had to figure out how to eat the wild berries or something like that. But to make it through the darkness of the night alone and by yourself. Now, that was the challenge. But the way it was conducted, and I don't know how they kept this a secret from the next generation, or they kept it from each other and, don't tell the kids sort of thing. But the rite of passage worked itself out that as the dawn came again, as the sun began to brighten the surroundings, as the young brave sat there probably chilled through the night because he didn't even think to bring a blanket or something, he realized as the shadows receded that there on the edge of the clearing, in the darkness that he couldn't see, but now is beginning to perceive, sat his father. Maybe with his uncles, I don't know. But that in fact, through the darkness of the night, he had never been alone. He had never been alone. Now that is the biggest challenge for a Christian to embrace. To feel that our Father in heaven is not in any way variable or turning. His emotional commitment, if you will, his spiritual commitment, if you will, his physical commitment never diminishes. No matter what it is that we're doing or how we're failing or whatever we're feeling, there is a reality, even though we can't perhaps realize it at the moment, but we have to go through the darkness and come to the other side to realize, he was and is always there. Perhaps the way I should express it, within arm's length, within the sound of our voice, that we are always safe. Because just as the mature adult never left his son alone in the forest to be, mauled by a bear or assaulted by a wild animal or to perish in the cold of the night or something like that. He, our Father in heaven, is, as Paul expresses, Abba, or Father. In fact, if I could go one step further, he promises to be a father to the fatherless. And how many widows, how many single moms have to claim that promise? And how difficult it is during harsh times, through times of feeling abandoned and alone as you struggle through those passages that we all struggle through as parents, but how much, without somebody to lean on. But you have to learn to lean on our Father who is in heaven. You are holy. You are all that implies. You are dependable, you are enduring, you are my rock, my stability. Well, it's a tall order to live up to, and I cannot claim to be, quote, a perfect father. But I have tried to be, and when I remember with some embarrassment passages in my life where I came to understand that I had to grow as I'll say it academically, as a parent. I had to become a dad in the realest sense. I think there was, there are dozens of them. One I particularly remember with some embarrassment was when my oldest son turned about 13. And I came home and said, where's the kid? Oh, he's out. It was after dark. Yeah, he's out. He's trying to learn to skate. Okay, I can't skate. What's he trying to learn to skate? Well, all the other kids can skate, and they're all playing hockey. And he can't do that. So I bought him some skates. You bought him some skates? Yeah, I bought him some skates. And he's out trying to learn. And he overwhelmed me at that point. The poor kid. Then suddenly, well, what am I supposed to do? So I got him a better pair of skates and what hockey school, power skating lessons. And then I got him into those things, and within a couple of years, he was actually enjoying learning to play defense. And I was always grateful to Darcy, because Darcy was a really fantastic hockey player, and he could have been semi-pro in his time, but he's older now. But he said, hey, let the kid play with me. I'll teach him 2 or 3 basics. And he actually mentored him and encouraged him, and I was always grateful for that. There were certain things I could do. Here, I got a Visa card, and there's a skating school. I'm going to send you. I can drive you there. In fact, becoming a dad meant that I had to get up on Sunday mornings and take him to hockey practice, with a church hockey team. And that meant I had to pick up 3 or 4 of his buddies. The irony is, 3 or 4 of those kids, they still remember with great affection to this day, I'm sort of an uncle or an honorary father figure to them, because I would schlep out on a Sunday morning after a long Saturday and take them to hockey practice at an unearthly hour as far as I was concerned. I wanted to sleep in, but I did that. And then, as a result of that, I actually learned to skate and enjoyed it. I wobbled a lot, but I learned to skate. I could never play the game, but I learned to referee, which gave me power. Almost enough power to get out of the way and not get killed. But anyway, it was a real changing point in my life. This poor kid is out in the dark trying to accomplish something that everybody else learned 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 years ago. And his mother had to do this, not me. This is embarrassing and hurtful. How does he feel? That was when my brain began to change, better late than never. And when I began to engage in certain needs that are very important to a young man. And so sooner or later, somewhere along the line, life humbles us, life teaches us. But the one thing I've learned from all those experiences is that God is a consistent, caring dad. And like the kid who has to learn that his dad is just on the edge of the clearing, and now I see with the sun coming up, there he is. Now I feel that reassurance. It's taken a lot of those experiences to sort of give me the nerve to say, yeah, I understand that now. I understand that. And I try to communicate that to other people. I hope today, no matter what the journey is that you've been on, that you understand that God is the consistent, perfect Father who is also your dad, who will never, ever let you down. And even though you know all sorts of stories about people who have let you down, who have all sorts of people who've let you down, there is a God who heals those things and binds those things together. Even though perhaps you've been, left alone as a woman through whatever the life circumstances, you will find that all of these things are taken into account by God, who has promised ultimately to be the father to the fatherless. And for that we give thanks and thank God in his grace. We're going to close in prayer. Ken, if you'd like to close in prayer, certainly. Come on, brother. All right, let's bow our heads. You just have to hold it.
Our Father in heaven, we do pray to you as a father every day and often. And we just want to come before you and absolutely thank you for this message today. And we want to thank you for the messenger. In the Bible, you've shown us, you've taught us that you came to live among us, to show us your love for us, that while human and divine, Jesus came, experienced the things that we experienced and lived through the trials and temptations that we face. And Father, he had a dad on earth. He had you as a dad, of course. We have been given a pastor in this church who we believe, by the things that he has experienced and shared with us, shows you to us. And today, Father, we thank you so much for the fact that our pastor showed us our Father by the things that he experienced and shared with us. And we say this in Jesus' name, amen.